the Holt Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 42nd President of the United States.
Thank you very much. Betty, thank you for the introduction. To the Holt family, Bertel, Philip, Alex, thank you for your wonderful work and happy 50th anniversary. To the young people here, that may sound like they were all born in the Stone Age. But if you're my age, 50 years pass in the blink of an eye. 50 years ago, America was in a lot of turmoil. We were heavily involved in the Vietnam War. We passed the Voting Rights Act, finally guaranteeing the right of every American citizen to vote free of unfair limitations and burdens. And we were uncertain about the future. We went through a lot of churning years there. On the day I became president, to give you an idea, that was 22 years ago. The average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. There were 50 sites on the entire internet. Worldwide. It was the province of research physicists. Email was an inter-office phenomenon. Everything went by snail mail. The day I became president, the White House mail load doubled. If we hadn't developed email, my administration might have contributed to more deforestation than any in history. And now look at all the changes which have occurred. On this 50th anniversary milestone, I want to especially congratulate ES founder Bertel Holt. In addition to all the work that is done on the Holt International Prize, which is featured at the Clinton Global Initiative every year, Bertel has dedicated his life to building bridges across cultures so that people can learn from one another, solve problems together, and share the future. In that sense, the values that have driven this organization for 50 years represent what I believe is the key to guaranteeing that the 21st century is the most peaceful, productive, and interesting and enjoyable period in human history. It may not turn out that way, and whether it does will be up in no small measure to you. You're going to have a lot of speakers today discussing various issues, and I have been asked to provide an overview of where we are and where we could go. I'll begin with the obvious. This is the most interdependent age in human history. And we view this interdependence, I think, in a more clear-eyed way than our forebears did 100 years ago when, on the eve of the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the wealthy countries of the world were actually slightly more dependent on international trade as a percentage of GDP than they are today. But we weren't nearly so interdependent in terms of travel and communication and obviously access to the same media, culture, money flows, everything else that binds us together. Today, I think we understand that interdependence means simply that our lives are connected, that what we do affect other people around the corner and half a world away, but that it could be a positive or a negative force, and human nature being what it is, and our state of development and collective consciousness being what it is quite often both. For example, in a few weeks I'm going back to my alma mater, Georgetown University in Washington, to give what will probably be the last of a series of speeches I've been giving over the last 2 years on composing a life in public service. And I was thinking about that because when I went there just a little over 50 years ago, we all assumed that the progress of the world would be ordered entirely by nation states, for good or ill. Now we know that our interdependence means that an 8-year-old can get on the internet and find out something in 30 seconds that I had to go to university to learn. Unfortunately, what you can find out includes how to build a roadside bomb, or even how to build a dirty nuclear bomb if you have a cookie's worth of fissile material. In other words, our interdependence is now a reflection of the dispersal of power in a way that enables young people to come up with great ideas, start new businesses, change the course of history. One of the young students who comes to the Clinton Global Initiative for University Students we have every year, a few years ago said, you know, Africans are at a terrible disadvantage because an enormous percentage of the medicine they get is phony and doesn't work. So people are sicker than they should be, and governments are spending money they don't have on drugs that are worthless. And he posited the prospect of setting up a website which became known as Sproxel, which will enable anybody, anywhere, in any ministry to check the validity of the drugs. It has dramatically reduced fraud, incredibly increased the ability of healthcare personnel to cure people of various conditions, and the company is now worth hundreds of millions of dollars because a young person with no money and an idea was able to use the technology of the modern world to solve the problem. That's the good news. But the world is in this fight with negative forces of interdependence because of the dispersal of power. And the places that are most vulnerable are the places where the capacity of a nation state, often aggravated by corruption, but not always, to maintain a monopoly on military force and on the terms of economic exchange are limited. So when we think of non-state actors, we think of the foundation work that EF does, the non-governmental movement that my foundation is a part of, and we have well over 1 million NGOs just in the United States alone. India has 1 million. China has 250,000 registered and probably that many more unregistered because of continuing political controversies. But on the other side of that divide are other non-state actors. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. And my foundation works in places where we see them in conflict. We're trying to prevent 1 million deaths from diarrhea of children under 5. 80% of the people who die of waterborne diseases in the world, from cholera, dysentery, diarrhea, are people under 5 years of age, almost all of them in poor countries. For 50 cents, you can buy an oral rehydration packet and zinc tablet that will maintain life. And so we started this project in Nigeria, and we went to the poorest parts of Nigeria, and our people are working in the north where Boko Haram kidnaps children. So far, they have been allowed to work, apparently because children under 5 have no economic or political value to them. But I thank God that they have been able to, because you can see in one of the poorest parts of Africa, where the poverty rate is about 75%, the interplay between the positive and negative forces of our interdependence. I believe the fate of the 21st century hinges on whether the positive or negative forces of interdependence dominate. Whether non-governmental organizations and businesses with both global and local reach can triumph over the alternative models of reality in the future offered by the terrorist groups, the people who would exploit poor places for their benefit and walk away without the children being educated, without the land being restored, without the countries being given a fair share of wealth, between all the negative forces of our interdependence. So, in a world like that, all of you, whether you're philosophically inclined to lean a little to the left, a little to the right, look for solutions in the middle, you all need a view, a framework within which to evaluate current and likely unfolding events. If you don't have some way of organizing these things in your mind, then whether you get your news from your computer or by reading a newspaper or watching a television, every day can seem like the political and social equivalent of chaos theory in physics. We all need some way of ordering reality in our brains so that we can figure out how to respond, what to do. So I'm going to give you the way I do it. Not so much in the hope that you will agree with me, but so that you will understand how important it is for all of you to have some way of thinking about the world so that all the disparate things that you see make some sense and give you some idea about what you can do. It will empower you to make a difference. First of all, there is often a difference between the headlines and the trend lines in the world. Or as I learned in my long career in politics, between the storyline that dominates the news about a subject and the real story. We're all best served if the storyline and the story are the same, if the headlines also reflect the trend lines. But alas, they rarely do, partly because bad news sells better than good news. But it's important. For example, the headlines are absolutely accurate and profoundly troubling. Yemen might descend into chaos. All the refugee children in the Middle East have the potential to create a new generation of terrorists or a new generation of people committed to peace and reconciliation. And they're going places where the governments don't have the capacity to take care of them. ISIS presents an existential threat to the existence, the very coherence of Syria and Iraq, and it seems committed not only to beheading whoever they want to put on television at a given night or on the internet, but also committed to exterminating the minority religions that have dotted the Middle East since before the time of Christendom, and shortly after the development of Judaism. The trend lines, however, are not as bad as the headlines. For example, this year, the Millennium Development Goals, which were articulated 15 years ago, will expire, and a designated group will replace them with sustainable goals for the next 15 years. Not all those goals have been met, but substantial progress has been made on nearly all of them, and 2 remarkably have been met. The goal of reducing the number of people living in extreme poverty. We know so much more than we used to about how to empower people to work their way out of poverty. To give you a tiny example, in the smallest country in Africa, Rwanda, where 4 years after the genocide in 1994, people were still living on less than $300 a year. A few years ago, the government decided to give a milk cow to every rural family, 1 milk cow, and to build in villages shelters so that the cows could be protected and milked, and facilities to save the milk. Within 2 years, they had moved almost 800,000 people above the international poverty line with the milk cow in a country of only 11 million. There are so many stories. I met a young man backstage who said that he was about to see a remarkable Bangladeshi citizen named Fazal Abed who founded BRAC, which is perhaps still the biggest microcredit organization in Asia, and which, along with Muhammad Yunus and the Green Bank, together proved that at least in one country, Bangladesh, you could have years and years of political conflict and still grow by an average of 6% a year if you gave enough microcredit loans to people at the bottom of the pyramid. That we weren't just helping individual stories or small villages, you could actually lift the country from the bottom up if there were enough of them done in the right way. So the poverty goal will be met. The goal on healthcare will be met. There has been a precipitous decline in infant mortality, a precipitous decline in maternal mortality. More and more people with AIDS in the developing world can look forward to having a normal lifespan. Malaria deaths have been dramatically reduced. We now are actually seeing in more and more developing countries people saying, okay, we used to have 25% of all the deaths in the world from AIDS, TB, malaria, and dirty water diseases. Now we have to look at the fact that cancer rates in poor countries are the same as they are in wealthy ones. And that in rising economies, there is increasing diabetes as people trade their good local diets in for high sugar, high carbohydrate, bulky but filling, faster foods, and create the same health problems we have in wealthier countries. For people who've been terribly poor, that's a terrible problem. But it proves that nutrition is also getting better even as they have these problems. So the world is a mixed picture. The headlines are nearly all bad today, but a lot of the trend lines are good. And a lot of the organizations affiliated with EF are making them better. You can make them better. Remember the student in Sproxel. You've all got an idea in your head. 30, 40, 50 years ago when this great company was born, if a person your age had an idea in your head, the furthest it got from your head was a research paper for a class. The NGO movement was much reduced from where it is now. The ability to communicate, to raise capital, websites like Kiva and My Choice and Donors Choose, and several others was simply not there. So keep in mind, every time you read something that really discourages you about the present and the future, ask yourself, is there a trend line here that proves I can do something about this, that proves that we can make it better? I think there is. However, there are three massive obstacles standing between you and the values which have shaped EF for 50 years, of a tolerant, constantly learning, cross-cultural community of people living and growing together. The first is that inequality is increasing not everywhere, but almost everywhere. It is increasing not just in the United States, where in this decade before the financial crash, 90% of the gains in income went to the top 10%. And after the financial crash, 95% of the gains have gone to the top 2 or 3% of our people. Primarily because we have a private economy, and when the banks were bailed out and people's mortgages weren't rewritten, most of the money aggregated at the top of the pyramid, and since the economy was weak, the incentive to invest was weak, and the incentive to trade was strong. And it led to all these shareholder first ideas and basically wealthy people circulating their money among themselves instead of making money in the way capitalism works best, by investing it in new jobs and higher incomes and greater training and education for their people and universal access to broadband and things like that. In the poor countries of the world, there is also a great deal of income inequality and inequality in access to capital to smart business, access to education, access to health care, which is normally accompanied by a gender gap where women are, relatively speaking, more disadvantaged than men. In Africa, we do, and in Latin America, in poorer areas, we do a lot of work in agriculture in my foundation. And most of the farmers we work with in Africa have 1, sometimes 2 acre farms. Sometimes 1 acre is farmed by a woman with a handheld hoe. But we have shown that they can double, triple, quadruple, even quintuple their incomes with basic things that have been done in advanced countries for 60 years or more. This level of inequality threatens the triumph of free market-oriented democracy, because all markets tend to self-destruct, as we know. And one of the great challenges for us is to figure out how to continue to create incentives for markets, incentives for new products and services, reward people for their successes, but do it in a way that keeps channeling capital downward so that we will have more consumers, more workers, more new businesses. And it's a challenge in the wealthy countries, most of them, and a profound challenge in the rising economies and the poorer countries of the world. The second big problem we've got is excessive instability. If you are in a business school, you know that you have to have a certain amount of instability in order for a market to work. If there were no instability, you'd have a totally static system. No one would ever put any capital at risk. No one would ever start a new business. If there were no possibility of failure, there would be no possibility of success in the way our system works. But if you have too much instability, it's just like a static system. People are afraid to invest, afraid to move. The economy cannot grow. That's what happened in the financial crisis. Too much leverage, too much instability, too much loss of common sense. But the main threat to instability today is the rise of autocratic capitalism, which leads to cronyism and kleptocracy, which you see in Russia, and which I personally worry about in one of the countries I consider most important for the future, Turkey. And you see it in the rise of these non-state actors, including ISIS, which has not only proved itself incredibly adept at assassinating people for electronic consumption, but also probably the best bank robber the world has ever seen. So we have to find a way to reduce instability without giving up our personal liberties or giving up the ability of a market economy to work. It will be a great challenge, one that I expect to go on for 10 or 20 years or longer. And all of us, including those of us who are not in government, not in the military, not in control of finance regulations, have our role to play. Every time people get on kiva.org and fund a small business in Kabul, Afghanistan, where $25, $50, $100 can make enormous differences, they're contributing not only to the empowerment and dignity of a person struggling in a difficult environment, but also to more positive stability in the world. If we stand up for the right of the Ukrainian people to keep their democratic revolution alive, I think we're contributing to the stability of the world. I think the sanctions on Russia are appropriate, and I think we have to do everything we can to get Russia to return to a more constructive role in the world. You can't have a 19th century top-down controlled, empire-driven model to run the modern world and expect good results. I'll tell you an interesting thing about another student competition. Every year, IBM runs a global competition on solving complex computing problems. It, like the Holt Prize, is open to any university in the world. When Russia took Crimea, I asked my staff to pull for me the results of the computing competition in the previous 6 years. I said, just give me the top 4 teams in the last 6 years. Russia was the only country that had a university that finished in the top 4 in each of the 6 years. The only country that had 2 of the top 4 finishers in 3 of the 6 years, and in 1 of the 6 years had 3 of the top 4 finishers. If I were building Russia's future, I'd rather build it on the brain power of the young people of Russia than on the military ability to crush a small neighbor that does not want to be Russia's enemy, simply a bridge between Russia and Europe. These are choices which have to be made. Choices you and people like you all over the world can influence, so that you have what I would call positive instability, not negative instability. And finally, your generation must face the reality of climate change and less visible today, but profoundly important reality of the destruction of local resources. Both of them a product primarily of our economic structure, and to some extent, in the case of local resource destruction, especially of valuable species, of the rise of non-state actors in the form of terrorist groups that fund themselves by violating rules against selling ivory, for example, by murdering elephants, or selling the powder from rhino horns by murdering the rhinoceros. And this is really important. There are, in fact, highly economical ways to deal with the problem of climate change. Yesterday I got an email from Tim Cook, the president of Apple Computer, about his recent announcement that they're investing $850 million to build a solar farm that will produce enough electricity to power their new headquarters and all of their offices and stores in California. There'll be a total green energy, zero emissions company when it comes to electric power in California. And they are going to make significant long-term savings because the power is free virtually once you build the array. The problem with solar and wind, which are both, if there were no subsidies anywhere for carbon, would be economical virtually everywhere today, is that The financing system allows you to build a carbon-based power plant and charge the ratepayers to pay for it over 20 years, but you have to come up with all the upfront money to erect a wind farm, to erect a solar array. If you had equal access to financing mechanisms and no subsidies for anything, we could convert the world to clean energy and develop the batteries necessary for storage and have backup carbon-based generators that would be rarely brought online in many places in the matter of a few years. And the same is true with almost all other greenhouse gas emissions. It's an economics problem that all of you can solve. So, to get back to the big picture, whenever I think about any issue, if we were having a question and answer period today, no matter what question you ask me, without even thinking, I would say which answer to this question will elevate the positive and reduce the negative forces of our interdependence? Which answer will decrease harmful inequality, decrease instability, decrease the threat of climate change, and the destruction of local resources? If that option will do those things, I'm for it. If the reverse is true, I would be against it. You all need a framework like that. And like I said, you don't have to buy into mine, but you need one. The next thing I would like to say is that how you live your life will bring you to a framework that is far more likely or far less likely to generate positive results. Why were two blonde-haired, blue-eyed Austrian teenagers, female, arrested trying to get to ISIS so they could either blow themselves up or help somebody else do it, and in the meanwhile kill as many non-combatant civilians as possible? Persecute the tiny Yazidi sect, which had been an embedded part of Iraqi society forever, because of the way they looked at the world, the way they felt alienated from the world, the way they thought they could get meaning from the world. Why did those two brothers think there was something noble about killing innocent young people who were running in the Boston Marathon here a couple of years ago? What is important to you? How can you get that to be important to other people? One of the things that I like about the Holt International Business School prize is that it's a competition open to every university on earth to solve a common problem, and even those who don't win are empowered by the effort because their imaginations are fired with the notion that yes, power is more dispersed, and yes, it may give more power to terrorist groups, just like it may give more power to the Gates Foundation, but I can make a difference. All you have to believe is that you shouldn't do nothing just because you can't do everything. You can all make a difference. This Holt Prize has been an amazing catalyst for impact. It's generated a whole new generation of entrepreneurs. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 or 15 years, I'll give you an idea, if you do a survey of what happened to all the teams, not just the winners, what happened to all the teams, you may find that the members of the teams that finished second or third or fourth had collectively a greater impact on the future of the world even than the winners. When I was a young man, much to everyone's surprise but my mother, I won a Rhodes Scholarship. And it changed my life, but it kept me humble when I read that a study had been done of all the lives of people who had been finalists, and that collectively the finalists had had a far greater impact on the world than the people who won. Because too many of us who had won thought we had arrived, whereas those who almost won kept striving to make a difference. I have a notion that this generation of young people never think they've won final battles and will always want to make a difference. But I think it's very, very important. Year after year, when I see the ideas that young people bring up for solving some of the world's most persistent problems, from fighting food shortages to more rapid deployment of scalable, cheap solar power, to last year's presentation that created a network of health workers to give round-the-clock diagnoses throughout the world. We had one crowd that wanted to give more protein to poor people through foods made from crickets. And I thought that was a little funny until I read about it, and I realized it was a serious proposal that had real merit. Then they actually convinced me that crickets could be quite tasty to eat. I'm not sure whether they're wrong or I was just blind to that stunning possibility beforehand. Another of last year's finalists, seriously, pointed out that bees have one of the most highly developed senses of smell of any living organisms, and that that sense of smell could be used as a diagnostic tool. When I read this proposal, it reminded me of what is the most important political book I have read in the last 3 years, and I highly recommend it to all of you. It's called The Social Conquest of Earth by the double Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist E.O. Wilson. 20 years ago, I first learned from reading one of Wilson's books that the combined weight of all the ants on Earth is greater than the combined weight of all the people on Earth. That is a lot of ants. If you decide not to read the book, which you could do quickly, it's only about 250 pages long, and it is a history insofar as the evidence permits us to learn from it, of all life on planet Earth, from the emergence of single-cell organisms out of the primordial slime, to the rise of the first Homo sapiens, roughly 200,000 years ago on the East African savanna, and down to the present day. And Wilson charts the rise and fall of species. And he said the most resilient species that have ever existed since life began on Earth are ants, termites, bees, and people. At various junctures along the way, all of them could have been completely exterminated, and they survived. He says for one simple reason: of all the species of life that have ever existed, they are the greatest cooperators. And he details fascinating examples of this cooperation, including the fact that the pollination of bees counts in one way or the other, directly or indirectly, for far more than 90% of the world's food supply. He talks about termites in hot climates building air-conditioned housing below ground, where they drill 5 holes, but will only go in and out of one. The rest is purely for air circulation. And when it's about to flood, they won't go in at all, so they'll survive. He talks about species of ants when being chased by predators. Some of the ants will just go up on the tallest sprig of grass and sacrifice themselves so that the rest will survive. He said, as far as we know, these creatures have no brains, no capacity for rational memory. This is done by evolution, but it has worked in marvelous ways, and the world is richer for it. Now, people are interesting. They have the greatest capacity for cooperation because they have consciousness and a conscience. And they have the greatest capacity for self-destruction because they are prone to intellectual arrogance and because their conscience can be hardened to emphasize the differences between us rather than what we have in common. And Wilson, who was about 82 when he wrote this book, said that even though he had spent his life warning against species destruction, and the rate of current species destruction is probably the largest in longer than 10,000 years, he was on balance optimistic, because when the chips are down, people have always chosen cooperation over conflict. That is the great test of your generation, and not just in wartime. I spent $3 billion of the American taxpayers' money to do America's part in an international effort to sequence the human genome, the completion of which we announced in 2000. It was a good investment, by the way. We've gotten $180 billion in private activity since then. But the most important finding of the Genome Project by far, for the purposes of everyone in this audience, is that every single non-age related difference you can see in this audience, every one, race, body size and shape, hair color, eye color, you name it, and gender, they are all rooted in just 1/2 of 1% of our genome, which means we're all 99.5% the same. And yet we all spend 99.5% of our time thinking about the 0.5% of ourselves that's different, don't we? I'm not just talking about politics, just generally. I do. Last night I went to a dinner leading up to the National Basketball Association All-Star Game, and I met a guard for the Milwaukee Bucks, and I looked at this young man and I thought, if I'd have had a body like his, I would have gone into a different line of work. I mean, we all do that, don't we? In some way or another, we do. We think about this part of ourselves that's different. Your generation, embracing the values of EF, have created the possibility of finding a way to glorify our differences and maximize our individual strengths in a context that says our common humanity matters more. And I will just close with this. It's my great honor to give out the Holt Prize every year. And a couple of years ago, they decided to divide the prize into 3 and have 3 different problems that needed to be solved. One of the problems was, okay, we know solar panels and dispersed power are now economical in poor places, but it's one thing to say and another to do. You have to be able to repair the solar panels, you have to have somebody that knows how to maintain them, you have to have a device to call for help, you got to figure out how to distribute this. So how would you distribute 20 million solar panels in very poor places throughout the world in a short period of time? I can't remember how long it was, like a year or 2. The winning team was from the New York University campus, not in New York City, but in Dubai. And the winning members of the team were from India, Pakistan, where they've been at odds over Kashmir since the 1950s, from China and Taiwan. So I called them out and I asked these young people, I said, are you absolutely sure you want this picture in your local newspaper? And they laughed and basically said a version, they all said the same thing. Oh, we are so over that. And they were. So many of the world's conflicts throughout my entire life have been caused by older people bearing grudges or outdated ambitions, suborning the imagination and hearts of young people to waste their lives instead of build them together. So that's the last thing I would say. The future of the conflict between the positive and negative forces of interdependence. The fate of the struggle for greater equality of access to the conditions of a good life. Less instability that causes death and destruction. And a future use of local resources and producing and consuming energy that enables us to not burn up the planet. It all rests on whether we choose cooperation over conflict, whether we believe our interesting differences are highly important, but our common humanity matters far more. To me, that is what the ethics and the values of this enterprise, celebrating its 50th birthday, represent. And I hope your lives will reflect it too. Thank you very much.